our feature address entitled The Evolving Future of AI and Generative AI. Here we are very honored to have with us Matt Fitzpatrick, Senior Partner and Global Leader of QuantumBlack Labs, McKinsey and Company. To introduce him, please welcome Nabeela Johari, Senior Vice President at Research of Khazanah. Over to you, Nabeela.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I apologize for my voice today. It's with great pleasure that I stand before you to introduce our distinguished speaker, Matt Fitzpatrick. Matt, a true trailblazer in the world of technology and innovation, is a senior partner and the global leader of QuantumBlack Labs, McKinsey's machine learning software development and R&D division. Matt's remarkable leadership extends beyond QuantumBlack Labs, as he also spearheads McKinsey's financial services, digital, and technology solutions. Among these, Matt founded FinLab, an elite team of data scientists, system architects, and engineers spread across key global locations, working tirelessly to develop scalable data and software applications for financial institutions. Drawing upon his extensive background, Matt empowers clients to revolutionize their businesses through cutting-edge technological tools, new digital product launches, and analytical use cases, which includes multi-channel customer acquisition and retention, natural language processing of contract data, fraud detection, smart operations, robotic process automation, and people analytics. Outside of work, Matt serves on the board of the Orchestra St. Luke's and passionately supports his beloved New York Knicks and New York Jets. Today, we have the privilege of hearing from a visionary leader who has dedicated his career to transforming industries through technology and innovation. So please join me in extending a warm welcome to our distinguished speaker. And without further ado, let's dive into what promises to be an inspiring and enlightening session. Thank you.
How do we get the slides up? Oh, there we go. Hi, everyone. So I thought I would, knowing the interest in AI over the last year, and there's some of it that's reality and some of it that's hype, I thought the best way to start would just be to talk a little bit about what AI is, and specifically within that, what generative AI is, because I think that's probably one of the more interesting topics of the last year, and there's not a lot of folks that actually understand how these models work or exactly what it is. So we're going to start with 5 minutes on that, if you'll bear with me, and then I'll talk about some of the implications. So just some of the things that have caused the, I'd say, extreme interest in AI over the last year in particular. Basically in the last year, you've seen Gen AI win an art prize. It's passed the US bar exam. It's actually passed the Google coding exam for engineering. So you've had a bunch of things that, the old question of the Turing test, which is from Alan Turing, basically one of the original inventors of the computer, which is, can you tell the difference between interacting with a machine and a human? And generative AI, particularly OpenAI's bot, was the first real advance that actually was able to pass that. And so what that enters into, if you think about the implications of that, is moving from the last kind of 10 years where we've had predominantly a graphical user interface, so you interact with everything in terms of a screen where you click, you can touch it, to a natural language interface where you'll be able to talk to a machine very casually. If you think about a Google search query where you might ask a question rather than typing it in, you're going to use language much more as an interface to talk to algorithms. Now, the interesting thing is this technology is not new. It actually dates back to 2017. Google released a paper which introduced the concept of the foundation model. OpenAI has taken that to the popularity you've seen over the last year. My personal view is actually a lot of the reason it's become so interesting in the last year is for the first time people can interact with AI. I think ChatGPT gave everyone a way on their phone to really interact with a bot in a way that most people had not had that experience before. But the core large language or foundation model technology has actually existed since 2017. And what happened, though, as you saw the launch of ChatGPT, is it is actually the fastest growing app in history. So faster to scale to 1 million users than any other app in history, whether that be Spotify, Twitter, or anything else. So that hype cycle is, I think, what's created a lot of the interest. Even though the technology is older, it was the visual interface layered around these models. And so, okay, what is a foundation model? A foundation model, and I'm going to explain the difference between machine learning and generative AI. And generative AI is what a foundation model it kind of enables, is trained off of the concept of absence. So what that means practically is in machine learning, you would start with a bunch of data. You'd have a preset set of 50, 100 variables, and you train that data to predict something like a credit score, just as an example. A predefined goal with a predefined set of data that you're going to train it very carefully to get there. A foundation model actually has a very different methodology. It trains models off of two main concepts, absence and attention. And so what you see there on the top is the concept of absence, which is effectively saying, and you see a sentence, all you need in life is blank. So you're training these models off of what is the missing word in that sentence. And what that allows you to do is to actually understand the vectorized string of text leading up to that word. So in other words, the computer is turning that string of text into an understandable string, and then it's understanding the relationship between those words. And that concept is called attention. So just to give an example of that, if I use the same word in two different contexts, I put my valuables in a safe, or I feel safe. It's the same word, but very different meanings and implications depending on the words that are around it. And so what the machine is learning in a foundation model is how to think about the relationship between the string of words, which word in that string is most or more or less important, and then the missing word. And so for the first time, a model is able to understand context and basically the building blocks of a sentence rather than one clear goal, which is how machine learning works. And so to bring that alive with an analogy, on the left side of this page, you see how machine learning would look at a vehicle. And so if you wanted to train machine learning to recognize a sedan or an SUV or a small van, you'd have to every single time train it off of images of first the sedan, and then the SUV, and then the small van. And it would have to understand exactly those kind of paradigms of what it's trying to learn. On the right side, you see how a foundation model would approach that, which is you could show it a sedan and a small van, and then for the first time introduce it to an SUV, and it would understand what an SUV is, because it would recognize wheels, it would understand the components of it. If you go to the prior page, it actually understands the components of a vehicle and what that means. That has real implications if you think about why ChatGPT is so fun to interact with. You can ask it a random unstructured question, and it's going to have a response to it because it's seen all of the components of that response. And so the biggest implication, and I'll talk now about like what this is good for and what it's not, is think about something like a contact center, which I'm sure many folks in the audience have called when you're unhappy with service or anything like that. The way a contact center always had to work before is routing. So you basically had a decision tree of logic that says, I've called the contact center, I'm calling for service, I'm calling for support, I'm calling for billing, and you're routing it, and then you're helping it come to a decision based on a pre-designed flow. Well, in generative AI, it's the exact opposite. You actually can start to ask unstructured questions, and the machine, for all the reasons I just ran through, will know how to respond to that. Now, all of that said, and I think this is probably the most important thing I hope you would take away today, that does not mean generative AI is good at everything. And I think lost in some of the hype over the last year is a view that generative AI will suddenly replace everything and do everything. It's actually pretty specific at what it's good at and what it's bad at. And to bring an example, I mentioned a credit score earlier. So generative AI would actually not be very good at predicting a score, a decision, anything where you want to know exactly a predictive view of where you're going to end up. A credit score is much better with traditional machine learning for a whole host of reasons. One, I can clearly see what factors determine the score, so I can make sure there's no bias. I can understand exactly what said a good score or a bad score. But also, my result is much more predictable. I know exactly where I'm going to end up most of the time if I've trained the models well. Generative AI is actually more of a black box. You don't always know how it will answer or what decision it will come to. And so most of the uses of generative AI relate to, I'd say, 4 main topics. And very few of them are actually going to be decisioning in any form. One is synthesis. So if you think about if I have 50 books and I want to summarize those books, that's a really good use case for a language model. And again, because it just understands text and it understands the importance of where to focus. Expert support is another one. So think of anything where you're asking a query around, like, how do I fix this issue or understand this technical challenge? Those two are, I'd say, getting some interest. The biggest two by far, though, right now, are code assistants. So think of any legacy coding language like COBOL that you now have to kind of refactor into more modern coding languages. Basically, engineers are a lot more productive using a code assistant like this. That is how it passed the Google coding exam. And I'd say the biggest one by far is customer experience, contact centers, all of the ways where you interact with a customer or client, service calls, all of that, where you're going to ask free-form questions. Generative AI is really, really good at that. All of that is to say, both of these are still going to be important. And I think that's another kind of key thing I'd ask you to take away from today, which is generative AI on its own is not going to, there is a lot of hype in the concept of generative AI on its own. But AI encompassing machine learning, traditional statistics, generative AI, together is a very powerful mix. And I'll show you an architecture of how that all, these are the 4 examples I mentioned earlier. So customer engagement, coding, content generation, and concision. So there are some really interesting implications if you think about something like content generation. If you're writing a book, for example, and you want a first draft of a chapter where you want to summarize 50 topics, like the ability to do that now is probably better than it's ever been. And I think the other interesting implication of that is education. So all of the take-home book reports that were the staple of education for years, you're seeing more of that move into in-classroom formats or out of classroom where they openly say students can use these sorts of technologies for synthesis. One other key thing I'd highlight is the question I get most often is, am I going to have to build this all from scratch if I want to get started with this? If I want to build a model, there's tens of billions of dollars right now from venture capitalists around the world going into a whole ecosystem of this tech, whether that's content writing, search, app prototypes. What's going to evolve with this is the same way that the iPhone enabled an application ecosystem of many of the apps that we all use today. There'll be a whole suite of these tools that you will layer on top of any foundation model you build. So you're not going to be reinventing the wheel from scratch every time. You'll be using one of the kind of readily available large language models paired with all of this tech to operationalize a lot of it. And I think that is a really interesting implication in the next few years, is just the amount of investment going into this space is probably bigger than any area in tech in the last decade, really. One of the big implications of that, by the way, is a human voice overlay on these models. So the ability to actually have a conversation. And if you think about ChatGPT 5 years from now, where rather than typing in questions, you'll just be able to talk to your phone and have a conversation, that is a pretty big shift in terms of, from an implication standpoint. But this is the kind of final point, and then I'll get into some of the risks to close. This is an architecture of, if you wanted to, many of you may think about this in your own organizations, like, how would I actually go do this? The biggest thing I would highlight is, I think when we started this kind of the post-OpenAI journey 10 months ago, folks thought the answer for this was, I would hook up I'd hook up an OpenAI or a Cohere model, and I would just push this out to my clients, my customers, my team in the field, and it would all work. There are real risks and complexities to that. The biggest one is what's called hallucinations, which, as I mentioned, that generative AI models are black box. What that does lead to is strange and unpredictable outcomes that you can't always predict when you ask it a question you didn't intend to. So, like, the example I would give is, I worked with a bank that was coming up with credit card recommendations, and you'd be pretty surprised some of the things people ask when they're deciding on a credit card, like, what if I want to buy this bag? Or, like, what if I want to go on this trip? And the model is not trained off of those. You don't know what edge cases or questions it's going to get asked. And so a lot of what you have to make sure is that you put bounds around the outcomes you're getting from a generative AI model. And so the general way to do that is to not leave a generative AI or foundation model to make decisions and directly connect with any end user, but to set up this kind of layer, kind of application layer that sits on top of it. And in that, you'd combine machine learning with generative AI, with traditional statistics, for an integrated set of conversations. So an example being, if I'm going to make an offer or decision of price, or try and save a client or customer that might leave, that action that I take should be determined by machine learning, which is predictable, highly auditable in terms of what it's come up with. But the wrapper of the conversation that goes around it, the outreach method, the way I communicate with that person, that's going to be generative AI. And so what you see here is kind of the hookup to both foundation models and data, the foundation model itself that then gets pushed to this post-processing layer. And in that layer, you're going to screen for things like bias, like hallucinations, like toxicity, anything that would seem offensive, and you're going to wrap that and combine that with a machine learning-based outcome to get to an end offer, and so or an end output. So an example of that might be if you know that you're going to go into, you want to offer a customer a certain price, you're not going to do that with a Gen AI model, which might determine a price you don't want. You're going to have a machine learning model or even an expert that determines the price, but then wraps it around a conversation. And that's kind of the main, what I would say about this diagram is this is pretty hard to do. This is not easy. And in fact, if you look at the last 10 months, I'd say a lot of companies have struggled to get these operationalized in the field, despite all of the excitement and hype around them, because this is not an easy thing to do, to trust your customers, your clients, your team, to interact with this sort of a model. You need to be pretty confident it's right. And again, I think for the last 10 years, people have been pretty comfortable with how machine learning works. This is pretty new, and so it's not easy. And so I'll close with two final slides. What are the implications then for society as a whole and kind of the areas where this will affect the most? The main thing I will highlight is, despite, I think, the hyperbole in the news that would suggest everything is going to be disrupted by generative AI in some form, if you actually break down like an industry view, there are a lot of sectors that aren't going to change all that much. I mean, I don't think this is going to materially impact metals and mining. I don't think it's going to materially impact oil and gas. I mean, there are components that it will, but the core functions of those businesses will stay largely the same. And I thought it was really interesting in the talk to this before, where folks talked about all of the new jobs that will emerge, as you have shifts in societal trends. I think the more likely outcome of this is you have certain industries that do get changed pretty significantly, right? And so if you look at the top, software and technology with code assistance, media with kind of text generation, whether that's script writing, book writing, journalism, that is going to change pretty materially, because this is a really good use case for that. If you think about telecom and the implications of contact centers, again, that's not the core of the business, that's a part of it, but that will probably pretty materially change. But as you bring all of this together, it doesn't mean that everything is affected by Gen AI. But there are some things that will pretty materially change, and I think the biggest one, if I take some of the more provocative views on this, is the way that you will interact with your app ecosystem and your technology. The concept that's been raised a lot is you will move to having almost a digital assistant that you converse with, and that assistant interacts with your app ecosystem. Rather than right now, you might have 50 different apps that you go to each day to do a different task. The conversational interface is a very different way to interact with technology, and that will be one of the things this enables. And so finally, I'll close with some of the risks of this, because I think there are pluses and minuses to every technology advancement. I thought the last panel covered that really well. There are some real complexities, like IP infringement is the one that I think is perhaps the most interesting. So you've seen a lot of Hollywood actors sue over the use of their voice. IP is a really complex thing in this landscape. If you think about the statement, write me a script that is written like Steven Spielberg and narrate it in a voice that sounds like a famous actor like Morgan Freeman. It's complicated because that's actually neither actor nor writer, but it's in the style of. And so the definition of IP and what you can protect when you're able to simulate, you can have ChatGPT write you a poem like Shakespeare. It's not a Shakespearean poem, but it reads like it. That's going to be a really interesting and complex thing. And again, I think this is why a lot of organizations have struggled so far to really operationalize these, is they're not really sure of the IP implications of what they launch and where they need to be careful on that. And I think that's something that's still being figured out over the kind of current year. The other kind of two big ones up here is at the top. So impaired fairness. So I do think, again, because these are black box models, you don't always know what it's going to say, and you don't always know. Machine learning is a highly auditable, highly predictable outcome, which is why regulators have gotten really comfortable in preventing bias and things like that in the machine learning-based outputs. That's much less clear with Gen AI. So I think that's going to be the other challenge is the paradigm that we're seeing as people think about managing risk is in machine learning, you spend months training, and then you have a model that works. And in generative AI, you're going to be able to stand up a conversational interface pretty quickly, but you're going to spend months then quality controlling that and making sure that what it yields is fair and carefully managed. And I think that's an interesting paradigm. And I think the final thing I'll say is, I do think if you think 5 to 10 years from now, this is a major step forward because the ability to have a natural language interface with a model is a really interesting paradigm that has not been true. If you think about early chatbots from 2 to 3 years ago, everyone does not like interacting with them. So that is a pretty big step forward. I think the media has had more hyperbole than reality in terms of the near-term implications, and that I personally at least think it will take some time for this to operationalize. But when it does, it will be material. So with that, I'm going to move to questions.
Oh, thank you, Matt. Thank you for such an insightful and thought-provoking presentation. As we wait for questions to come in from the crowd, I like to kick things off with a question of my own. So in recent years, we've seen that there's a surge in the size and complexity of the foundation models, right? So how do you envision businesses to effectively manage and utilize these models to extract maximum value? And what, in your view, constitutes the best business model for these foundation models?
Yeah, so I think the thing I talk to most folks about is all of the third-party data that goes into these models is going to become readily available and effectively commoditized pretty quickly. So unlike machine learning, where people spend a lot of time thinking about various third-party data sets they could bring in, et cetera, I don't think that's going to be a huge part of this next horizon. And I think the interesting thing is a lot of the data that will be most interesting for these models is probably not data that folks have organized right now. So like the example I would give is transcripts from sales calls or contact centers, issue resolution calls from help desks. This is not stuff that most people have ever organized or structured. And so I think the thing I'm seeing most folks spend time on now is what is language data that would be helpful and useful, and how long will it take me to get that organized so I can train one of these models off of it? I think the challenge is going to be this is not something you're going to be able to buy, if that makes any sense. Like most organizations, whether that's nonprofit, whether it's company, like they're nuanced and specific enough that the way you're going to want to use the language and kind of benefits of this are going to be specific to your organization. And so there's not really going to be an off-the-shelf foundation model that's going to be useful for most folks. And so you are going to have to go through the process of training it off of your relevant data set. So the biggest question I ask is, what data do you have that would be relevant for something like this that you want to train a model off of?
Okay, I agree with you. I think we need to sort of manage the costs when it comes to issuing some of these solutions. Perhaps we can take some questions from the floor. There's one over there. Number one.
Sorry, my name is Malik from BFM Radio. We're a media company that is affected by generative AI. I'm trying, I guess, when you say train, so I've experimented a little bit with training an AI chatbot, and I think what happens is that it takes information and through LLM, through other sources and everything, and the information comes out a little bit, not slightly outside my domain, and maybe not as accurate, not as specific, not as customized. How does one practically train? I've been putting in things like FAQs and everything I know about what our organization, the way we answer things, but it doesn't seem to be enough. There's a lot of, the things. How does one train AI?
That's a great question. I think the biggest step for any organization to take when thinking about these models is what is the corpus of data that you train a model off of? Because look, the models at OpenAI and Cohere and the big large language foundation models that exist are off of the full corpus of the internet, but a lot of stuff that's not all that relevant to you. Like they may be good at describing 80s movies or the history of certain countries, but that's not actually relevant to your organization. And so what you have to think about is if somebody were starting your organization tomorrow and you wanted to train them on the full corpus of information that shapes your thought process, what is that? Maybe it's FAQs, maybe it's all the historical content you've produced, maybe it's interviews. By the way, this is one that we're seeing a lot of folks start to think about is interviewing some of their best people and uploading those transcripts. Maybe it's call interactions you've had. But these models are only going to be as good as the data that is used to train them. And if you have different cultures, different organizations are all going to have very different ways they're going to want to behave. And so you're not going to be able to use that goes to my point earlier, you're not going to be able to use the off-the-shelf technology. But I think my guess is if you think hard about the data, there's a lot you could have that would shape it correctly.
Thank you, Matt. Is there another question from the floor? Oh, yeah, number 4.
Hello, this is also my second day in Khazanah, and so I think the most pressing question on a lot of our minds is with this advancement in AI and foundation models and all, our jobs may be at risk, and second day on the job, I don't want to lose my job as well. So I'm thinking most of us have the same sentiment, and what jobs do you think in this room, in a room full of elites and professionals, that this may replace?
Yeah, look, I think the panel before me said this, frankly, better than I could say it. I was in complete agreement with the idea that 60% of people, I'd never heard that stat before, but 60% of people in school will operate in jobs that don't exist. If you look at the way that society evolves over time, like the Harvard Computer Science Department, my year when I graduated, I did not go to Harvard, but my friends that were there had 6 students. I mean, if you look at the change in the last 20 years, the iPhone is only 12 years old. Or I don't know, 13, somewhere around that. But the jobs that exist and that will be created as a result of that are frankly just as big and interesting as some of the ones that will disappear. And so I think what has existed over the last 50 years and as technology has moved forward is new things are created and other things that were manual. I mean, think about the percentage of society that worked in agriculture 50 years ago. As that's become less manual and frankly helped extend human life, those jobs have moved to many other jobs. And I think a similar pattern will follow here. I think the thing the panel before me said really well is, I do not think you're going to move to a world where AI is determining outcomes and operating unassisted for a long, long time. This is more about human enablement than it is about, I think, replacing everything, because the reality is humans are what enables this to work well and to scale. And so a lot of it is thinking about, I use the term code assistance in engineering. I don't think AI is going to be able to write computer science programs for decades. I think it will help engineers get more productive. But interesting, if you look at historically, the way that they've done that is GitHub. And so in many ways, Gen AI is just a more efficient way to do what they were doing already and will hopefully create more engineering productivity for the world.
Yes, there's definitely a lot of opportunities for jobs to augment with AI. Can we take questions from number 5? Thank you.
Adiba from the higher education sector as well as healthcare. I'm going to ask you a question so that I don't have to answer Nick this afternoon. A couple of days ago, I think University of Texas San Antonio announced that they're offering a dual degree in medicine and AI. Should we all be rushing to do this, or should the doctors stay in their lane and the scientists, the computer scientists, stay in theirs?
That's a great question. So one thing that there's an interesting point that Gary Kasparov, so I'm going to quote a strange but I think relevant fact. He points out that in chess, when you use AI in chess, if you take the best expert in chess and you pair it with AI versus a medium expert paired with AI, the medium expert will beat the expert because it effectively does not have so many preconceived notions going in and ends up being more effective. And I think there's a way in which, for people that are still at points in their careers where they want to learn and grow and expand, even if you're not a computer scientist, just understanding AI in your daily life, that's going to be, I think, the next generations of leaders that will shape a lot of different sectors. So if I think about healthcare, where gene editing, gene sequencing have been huge changes, and there are so many different parts of the healthcare system that have, I do think if you look at advances, whether that's drug development, drug discovery, clinical trials, patient management and compliance on medication, all that stuff, that's all, AI has been a huge enabler of much of that. And so if you don't understand how that works, it's hard to use it effectively. And so I think more and more, if I take a different sector, but the hedge fund space, if you look at 5-7 years ago, the hedge fund space would have traditional fundamental analysts who worked in Excel, over here, and then it would have quants over here. And what it's moved to over time is more translators that know how to use AI. They may not be engineers, but they work side by side with the engineers to get to outcomes. And I think the same will be true of healthcare and many of these other sectors where you will have people that are technology fluent, even if they're not hands-on keys coders.
Thank you. Well, I love this. So many questions. Number one.
My name is Gunasegaram. I'm a writer and a columnist. I just would like your views on some of the popular AI apps around the place. Which do you like and which don't you like and why?
AI apps generally, that's a broad question. I think so I'll give one that was on my chart that I think is kind of interesting, Glean, which is basically an internal enterprise search tool. But what's interesting about that, that's about 4 to 5 years old. Let's say your organization tomorrow wanted to look at all the internal data that existed across it, but that sits, some of it's in Gmail, some of it's in laptops. There's no structured organization for it or way to search that. Glean is a tool that uses large language models to basically query all of that. The same way that Google would have for the web, it does that off of an internal database, which I think is pretty interesting. I obviously think ChatGPT is an amazing tool. I'm pretty intrigued by the fact that actually OpenAI is now partnering with Johnny Ive, the inventor of the iPhone, to basically not necessarily make better AI, but make an interface where humans can interact with AI more intuitively. I think that's been, for me, as having spent the last 15 years working in technology, what I think has been so fascinating about ChatGPT is it's not, the back-end technology is interesting and good, but it's not necessarily, there is other tech like it, but the interface just brought so many more people into being interested in AI, and I think you're going to see a lot of that over the next couple of years. What I'll describe that as bringing design as a front end to back-end engineering is, I think, the next step of this, and I think that'll be really interesting to see.
All right, thank you. Number two.
Thank you. My name is Rai. I'm a member of the Board of Governors of Binary University. Matt, I heard the positive side of AI and the commercial value, the conveniences it will bring. While you highlighted some of the risk, I think I would like to alert in a sense that you said it will take a while before AI sort of dominates everything. But I think the way we have seen things growing over the last couple of decades, things move faster than you anticipate. I believe AI is going to sort of dominate very quickly. The dangers which it will pose, I think it's not being highlighted. I think in our rush to think that it will do many, many things, I think it's time for us to actually, maybe you should be, since you're the expert, you should come out, spend more time on the dangers, see what sort of regulations that have to be put in place to ensure that the dark side of AI does not finally overtake the benefits of what we seem to be looking at. Thank you.
Look, I'll say two things about that. I think one of the interesting things the last year is there has been a lot more calls to regulate AI. So I think for something that operated below public interest for a long time, you've seen many of the most prominent voices in technology come out openly for AI regulation. So, by the way, machine learning, just as an example, is highly regulated. Like if you think about most of the banks when they're underwriting, highly regulated the way that that's implemented. So I don't think this will exist unregulated in perpetuity. I think actually one of the benefits of the hype cycle we've seen is there should be more regulation that follows. That's what I'd start with. I think on the time to implement question, look, most people seem to think this will happen faster than I do. I am not a pessimist, but I'm conservative in how long I think it'll take. And I think the reason for that is look, LLMs have been around since 2017. They have had a lot of excitement, but the reality of them is still pretty nascent, even in that. And look, I've spent the last 15 years looking at how machine learning is implemented, and it has impacted society, but it's still pretty early. and it's pretty complex to implement, and it still requires a lot of human time to get it useful. So that doesn't diminish any of what you're saying. I agree that thinking about regulation, the implications, is something we all have to do. But I also think it's going to, like the future state vision of the singularity and some of the more scary views of AI, I think that is, I'm not sure that will ever come to pass. And I think AI itself will take a lot of time. And frankly, I think it's better that the public interest has inspired folks to spend time thinking about things like regulation. I think it's now come to a view where every government official in almost every country is thinking about how they're going to implement that, whether that's data privacy in the EU or actually pure AI regulation in many regions. So I think I am of view that the last year has been positive in that front.
Yes, I understand the concern, but I think AI is still at the early stage, and everyone's coming together, led by Europe, China, and the US in terms of regulation for AI. Question number 3, please.
Hi, Matt. This is Johari. Coming from FSI, it's interesting that I saw your chart where the banking and insurance is right up there in terms of the impact. How do you see in terms of the central banks and the regulated authorities aligning themselves with the speed that Gen AI is moving towards? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think part of the reason I did not put, or we did not put banking and insurance as high on that list is actually a lot of the core business functions of banking and insurance are more likely to use either traditional like actuarial statistics or machine learning in terms of underwriting, decisioning. That's more the core function if you compare it to something like media. And that's actually a very regulated set of processes right now. I mean, anyone who's worked in banking insurance knows that you spend a lot of time making sure that you can really clearly articulate and explain every decision that's coming out. Generative AI, in terms of its function in those industries, I think will be more around the customer experience, customer interaction sides, which is still really important, and I think will be, again, I think in that case, it may be interesting to think about how you improve your mode of interaction, the conversational quality you have with your customers. And so I think it's a less regulated portion of the function in those two industries, is my opinion at least.
Thanks. Number 3.
Hello, I'm TJ from the Sunway Center for Planetary Health, and I actually have a background in AI. And I wanted to ask specifically about AI detection tools that's coming up, most of which has been developed in response to kind of catch academic plagiarism. So like, with your understanding of the mechanics, I just wanted to ask how effective would these tools be, and can they play a role in terms of tackling misinformation, especially of what we see in the media?
Okay, so there are some areas where I think those will be really interesting. So like image generation. I think one of the most interesting implications for anyone who's used DALL-E, which is basically a lot of the generative AI implications, for, models for images, or if you look at the two founders of South Park have both raised a bunch of technology on what's called deepfakes, which is effectively putting a new face of any kind on an image you want. So I think one of the interesting challenges of the next 5 to 10 years is that we've always held images as truth. Like if you see something in a photo, it's true because you can see it. And that may cease to be true. There have been a couple, I won't go through them all, but there have been a couple of interesting examples of where you can take a face and say, create this person doing this thing with this person, and it will create that image for you. So I think actually image generation is going to become one of the most important of these, where, coming from a world where we had, various Instagram filters and ways that you could alter images without necessarily people becoming aware of it, I think you're going to move pretty quickly to a world where you have an alert that tells you if an image has been doctored or not. Because I think it's going to become too complicated to, in the media, you suddenly see a picture that looks like it should be inflammatory, but it's just fake. That is going to become commonplace. And so I think image generation will be one of the areas that's going to become really important. Where it becomes more complicated is when you write a paper and you think about the sources of that. Is it generative AI written, or is it written by an individual? Education being one of the biggest examples of that. That, to me, is harder and more complicated to audit. Partly because with prompt engineering, you're not going to ever get the same paper twice if you ask the kind of a foundation model to generate a paper differently. So it's much harder to tell whether it was altered as opposed to a picture where you can tell the source. So I think that's going to be one of the big questions, and to the point earlier on regulation, I think there will be a whole set of guardrails that start to come up around what's genuinely produced versus where you've had a first draft produced by a machine or an image produced by a machine. I think there'll be a whole wave of tech around that. And I think that's really important.
Right, thank you. Question number 4.
Hi, Matt. Thanks for your presentation. Rachel Gong from the Khazanah Research Institute. Taking into consideration your points about the appropriateness of use of AI and kind of the promise of AI for a country like Malaysia, I'd kind of like your thoughts on 3 issues that I was thinking about with respect to that. The first being language, right? You've talked about how these models need a training data set, and that's all very well if you have a good English data set. But when you have a country with many languages like Malaysia, you know, what's the sort of solution or what's the consideration that gets taken into account there? Number 2, on costs, when we think about opportunities for businesses and small and medium enterprises making up the bulk of Malaysian companies, what's the opportunity and how do we deal with the challenges in those areas? And third, on the appropriateness of use, I noticed that agriculture, for example, wasn't on your map of areas, and manufacturing kind of falls into the lower end. So I was just wondering where you see, or you know, as part of the discussion, where Malaysians might see opportunity for the use of these technologies in our economy, and does it become really elites and MNCs and big companies taking advantage of this opportunity, and what that then implies for not just the digital divide, but inequality in general? Thanks.
Okay, that's several questions. I'll take the last one first, and then I'll take the 2 others, because I think they're linked. Agriculture, I think, is one of the industries most affected by AI over the last 20 years, but just not generative AI is the main point I'd make. So if you think about things like crop forecasting, yields, you know, weather forecasting, AI has played an enormous role in technology generally in advancing that, and so I think that will be incredibly affected by AI, but just not language models. To your question on big companies versus small companies, you know, I actually am of the view that smaller companies may be more able to use this if they are nimble in redesigning their processes around this. I think the hardest question with utilizing generative AI or ML effectively is if you've got a really established way of doing something that you've done for 40 years and there's a big unwieldy workflow around that, it's actually pretty hard to reposition that. And so if you think about something like legal services and a small company trying to think about how they would clean sheet that, I think there's actually some really interesting ways for smaller companies to use this. And that gets to your questions 1 and 2, which is the cost model and then the language implications. So I think the cost model that exists now is going to change. And this goes a little bit to some of the questions earlier about how fast will this happen. So right now, the way you pay for these bigger models is you pay via an API call or a token. It's actually quite expensive. It's not an easy thing to do or to forecast the cost of it. So again, maybe just the pessimist in me, why I think we have not seen mass adoption of these yet is bigger companies and smaller companies are hesitant to say, I'm going to spend a ton of money and I don't know what the 5-year cost implications of that are. I think that cost model is going to change. I think if you look at like the open source LLM models, they're performing well. I think you're going to stop seeing such a high cost footprint to use these, like all technology over time. But your point on language is actually one of the most interesting ones, which is the big popular LLM models are based on the full corpus of the internet and how they interact. And so one of the implications for that is that they tend to be weighted towards language and what language are used most, and that the kind of cultural interactions are actually more weighted towards other regions that may have more of that internet corpus. And so one of the things we are seeing is what I'll call a small language model, which is I don't use the full internet that plugs into the OpenAI or Cohere model, but I start to train a model in my specific local context and language cadence and train it to be a local small language model. That's actually one of the things I am seeing more and more because, again, these models were built for full global use, not for local nuance. And the cost to actually stand up a small language model is not huge. And so I do think you're going to see over the next 5-10 years, a whole new set of uses around language models, but not necessarily using the big established expensive ones.
Thank you. Yeah, so a question about language, like we were meeting with a few people the last few months, and the thing is the first few foundation models were actually racist and sexist depending on the data that they were collected from. So now more countries, even in Asia, like in Korea, the big internet guys are actually collecting data based on their their own language. So I think this is where it's going to go.
If you think about it as, it is trained off of the full corpus of everything that's been said, almost everything that's ever been put on the internet. So if you wanted to train a model to not have all of that content in it, you would actually pick the set of data you want to train it off of. And that's, I think, the next step in a lot of this evolution.
All right. We probably have time for one more question. Number one.
Hi, yeah. I work in media, so obviously I'm anxious about this kind of thing. I just had a question about, picking up from the last question. It's trained on the largest corpus of data made available on the internet. For media, with the way things are going in the States especially, a lot of these companies are investing billions in content, and they're having to pare back a lot of that, right? So it must be very tempting for someone like a Disney to start retrenching some of those guys and then just churning out, or using AI to churn out scripts, prompts, stories, things like that. And this is definitely something that's happening with Alibaba and Tencent already on their own video platforms. So I guess my question is, as a consumer and as a business person, right? How organic can these models keep being if they keep how do you say, training themselves on the data that they're generating? Or is that a loop that's been exaggerated?
Yeah, and look, I don't have a perfect answer for this. I think media is probably the industry that has the trickiest evolution over the next couple of years, because frankly, this technology is probably most relevant to content creation in some ways. I think one surprising thing for me has been some of the art prizes that AI has won. I think that surprised a lot of people. But I would note that in those cases, it was not AI generating art on its own. It was an artist using AI to shape art. So like an example I would give, there was a piece in the US that won a lot of prizes for taking thousands of hours of coral reefs imagery and then creating an evolving artwork based on that coral reef, kind of like almost like a moving set of shapes around a coral reef. But there was a human behind that thought to generate that. And I think, my inarticulate response to your question would be, what these models are doing is taking something that already exists and replicating it. And the vast majority of the media that's been interesting, whether that's columnists or movies or anything else, is something that feels original and interesting that you haven't seen before. So I think, my view at least is you will be able to churn out volume with some of this, but I think at its core, it's going to be more creative, interesting people using it to develop more ideas rather than the AI itself coming up with the ideas. I think most of probably the greatest user of technology over the last 20 years in the movie industry has been James Cameron, who brought us Titanic and then Avatar. And he thought of technology as a way to enable these grand visions that would never have been possible without it. I tend to think the same thing will be true. I don't think that on its own it will be able to do that.
Okay, we'll bring this session to a close. Thank you all for all the engaging questions. Matt, we really appreciate your time and insights today. Have a good lunch, everyone.
Thank you all.